welcome to episode number 25 of the ISPC Tailboard Talks. I'm your host, Mark. Again, Jerry is out on assignment. At some point, he'll get back here to join us, but for the next couple episodes anyhow, it is just me. Episode number 25. This is episode number 3 of a series of podcasts that we're doing with Jim Vaughn on equipotential zones and field safety when it comes to the electric utility industry. If you haven't heard or listened to episode 23 and 24, you may want to do that before you listen to episode 25. It's kind of a building block process, especially episode number 23, which deals with the laws and principles around EPZ. Without that, you may be a little lost or not fully grasping what we're going to talk about here today when it comes to transmission and induction. So, as with the previous 2 episodes, if you should have questions or comments or concerns, you can send those to Mark at ispconline.com. We will capture all those questions, and depending how many questions we get, the last episode of this series will be a Q&A session to kind of wrap those questions up and get everybody the answers that they need. Our sponsor for this episode, again, is T&D PowerSkills. Today's safety and training managers need flexible, effective solutions, and that's where T&D PowerSkills comes in. They have a 78-unit curriculum designed for adult learners. You can customize your training, scale your delivery, and control your costs, whether you're training a few crews or running a full apprenticeship program. For more information, visit tdpowerskills.com. Again, that's tdpowerskills.com. Again, our guest for episode 3 of this series, Jim Vaughn, Senior Consultant for the Institute for Safety and Power Line Construction, industry expert in grounding and bonding, among a lot of other things in our utility world, with over 50 years of experience in the industry. Welcome again, Jim. Glad to have you back.
And thank you, Mark.
Again, like I did for the first 2 episodes, kind of the ISPC Tailboard talk topic again is equipotential zone. Just kind of to reiterate, if you haven't listened to the previous 2 episodes, OSHA tells us that in 1910-269N3 that when we apply our temporary protective grounding, they shall be placed in such locations and arranged in such a manner that the employer can demonstrate will prevent each employee from being exposed to hazardous differences in electrical potential. So kind of just to get us kicked off here, Jim, we've talked about the distribution and underground world when it comes to EPZ on our last episode, and now we're moving into the transmission world. What changes? So what's different when it comes to the transmission world versus working in the distribution world when it comes to EPZ?
As far as the principles are concerned, of course, they stay exactly the same.
Yep.
But I think probably most people recognize that there are going to be some obvious elements that are going to be different, and some of that has to do with the power that we're involved with, because not only is it very high voltage, you do have, for instance, induction, which is it's a very real and dangerous component of transmission that I don't think people understand how dangerous it is. Certainly I didn't over the years as a lineman before I understood the nature of induction, and I don't think most people did. I mean, even if you go back and look at the consensus standards, they didn't really address controlling induction or the risk or the hazards of induction like you see in the past decades. And of course, OSHA has also very seriously addressed induction in the workplace, even though they messed it up in the way that they addressed it. At least they brought it to our attention.
I can sit here and say that, until a number of years ago, the company that I work for and the folks that I work with, it really didn't, we didn't put one and one together, right? And then as the more you research you do and the more people you talk to, like yourself in the industry, you start to put those pieces together and realize, oh, there is a pretty big issue here. And I was just out last week in Indiana doing a grounding and bonding class, and same thing, 2 different days, about 20 guys each day, and very young work group there too. A majority of their folks, I'd say 8 years and less of experience in the industry. And when you start to talk about these things with those folks and light bulbs start clicking and gaps start coming together, and you start to realize what you're dealing with, especially like you said, when you get to these higher voltages. It's something, and to your point, the danger that is really there is something that people need to understand, because if you don't deal with it properly, it could be your last time dealing with it.
Hey, in the last sessions that you went to, Mark, that you were talking about, did you hear anybody address induction as static?
I did not. And so that's a good thing, right?
Yes.
Because I think it's a big misconception that has been in the industry for years. And I know, you and I kind of met by you doing a third-party review of the grounding policy for the utility I used to work for. And it was referenced throughout that procedure several times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a matter of folks not understanding what's really going on there.
And here's a really big observation about static. And I heard it called that a lot during my career, especially. It's not a good thing to do, but there used to be, if you had an opportunity to expose an apprentice to an induction shock or something like that, linemen always took that opportunity. And I remember the time that I got taken was building a distribution circuit in the right of way for a 500 line out in West Broward. And as we built that circuit, and the circuit was about 5 miles long, and we clipped it all in, and now we were getting ready to install a couple of sets of isolation disconnect switches, and we were doing it off the wood pole because that was the nature of training apprentices. Even if the bucket was available, that we weren't doing that. And so we were a sticking company. We didn't glove at the time. This is before gloving was allowed. And so we had everything rigged in hoists on both sides of a tangent pole, and we were going to pull up the slack. We were going to install dead ends, and we were going to cut that phase and then install the switches. Now, cutting the phase wasn't a problem because it wasn't being used for anything. It was just disconnected at both ends.
Yep.
And it was grounded at both ends. And when we took the hotline cutter up there, I was holding one of the jumper holding sticks to hold the ends to fold them back. And we took the hotline cutter up there, and when we cut that phase, we started an arc, and that arc wouldn't quit. And we as apprentices, they didn't tell us anything about what was getting ready to happen. Nobody was going to be in any danger because we were hot sticking. We were below the cut. It was just going to be arc, and it was. And it was a pretty, large arc. And we all stopped working and looked down and said a lot of stupid things like, somebody made this hot. And they said, no, that's just static. And that's what they called it, static. Now, here's the problem of it. First of it, it has to do with, we have names for everything. And now when you look at a lot of standards, you will see the standard preceded by definitions. And it turns out to be pretty important because we can really underestimate and really we can, when we call induction static, we may be applying a misunderstanding of how dangerous it is, because the reality is that static is not very likely. I used to say won't, but it's not very likely to kill you. It's going to give you a memorable event that you're going to remember, for the rest of your life, but it's not going to kill you. Static is a voltage discharge that carries no current. Now, when we say not very likely, you can have a high enough static charge in your work environment that if you touch that static containing device or conductor or whatever you're talking about, it's going to discharge and equalize against your body. And if that static charge is high enough, and usually it involves somebody that has some underlying hidden condition, like a heart condition or something like that, where that sudden transfer and equalization of charge is almost the same thing, or feels like almost the same thing as a current transfer, an electrical current transfer, but it's not. It's an
Yeah.
equalization of electrical charges. But static itself does not need electricity or an electrical source in order to occur. And if you look up static on the using internet or whatever resource that you want to, you'll see that generally the description or definition of static is an electrical charge that occurs by the interaction of two non-conductive elements. When I was teaching in the college system as an adjunct professor of electrical technology, and people say, "Who would let you teach in college?" But I used to bring my cat and a PVC pipe to the classroom with me. And my cat was very, very cooperative, and she loved me, and she'd do whatever I wanted. So I'd stick her in a carrier and bring her to the classroom. And I would rub the PVC pipe with the cat and create an electrical charge.
Yep.
And then what we would do in order to show that electrical charge was created, we built the class as part of the class. We built little capacitors using those old film canisters that you used to get with 35 millimeter film, and we'd coil one wire inside and bring it through a hole in the cap, and then we'd wrap a coil of wire on the outside and bring it up, so we would have two leads that were sticking up above the cap. And so what was happening was we created a capacitor, and when we put it near the end of the PVC and we rubbed the cat on the PVC, we would actually charge the little capacitor, and then we could touch it with a paper clip and it would spark, and everybody would see that we created this electrical charge. Now the same thing happens under helicopters. Now this is interesting because the electrical charge that occurs on a helicopter was thought to have something to do with wind, and it sort of relayed over into our industry, where people said, and I hear this all the time, and it's not true under most all cases, and we always have to say almost true or almost always, because it's there's no absolutes except when it comes to principles. So you have heard that a power line up in the air, that wind can blow across that power line and create a voltage, and that's not true. Now here's where that electrical charge comes from on those power lines sitting up in the air that everybody accuses wind of doing it. Now remember, our definition for static has to be two non-conductors in contact with each other. Well, a conductor can also be part of the element, but that thing about wind comes from helicopters, and it comes from helicopters because of the assumption that people under the helicopter handling such as a suspended load or something like that gets an electrical shock. That is a charge, an electrical charge, but it's not coming from wind off of the prop or the main rotor that's blowing that's 100-mile-an-hour wind down from above the helicopter. And we know that because of some testing that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers and Training Standards or something like that, doing some research and cooperation with the university study, because they said, where's this static coming from? Because when they started to employ helicopters, and as I understand the backstory behind the training, in Vietnam, where helicopters became a very, very common usage and mode of transport, somebody had the idea of putting rockets on them and guns on them and stuff like that. And those rockets, in particular, the rocket pods, are fired electrically. And sometimes, or as it occurred or became a concern, that if when they landed a helicopter, just before it touched grounds, they would have unwanted rocket launchers. So, I mean, this is the backstory that I heard and that I read when I was doing this research. But the study still shows us where the static comes from on helicopters, and it turns out not to be the downwash from the prop. The majority of the electrical charge occurred because the helicopter, as an isolated floating conductive object, was flying through, guess what? The electrical charge of the Earth. How does a compass work? Magnetic charges. And these magnetic charges have, they're striated, and we have North Pole and South Pole in the Earth. And we already know the physics will tell us that there is very high negative charge voltage on the Earth. And then when there's a very high positive charge voltage in the sky, what happens between the two of them? Boom, lightning occurs. Well, these helicopters had the same issue. A helicopter, a conductive object flying through the negative charge of the Earth at very close to the Earth, where the negative charge was very high, was flying at different elevations and collecting an electrical charge. So in collecting this electrical charge, the skin of the helicopter becomes electrically charged. Anything hanging below the helicopter, attached to the helicopter, has an electrical charge. And so as it comes down toward the ground, an individual standing on the ground who comes in contact with a suspended load is at a different electrical charge potential than the helicopter load. And that electrical charge potential discharges to the individual, and the individual gets shocked. Now you'll see these. There's some pretty cool videos, and I have one in our training program that we use of a guy who's a helper getting ready to receive a load, and he reaches up and he touches that load and he lets go of it very, very quick when he gets that electrical shock. And so we hear about it and we see about it. We see it all the time. And if you work around helicopters, you may have experienced it. You know that we use methodologies to prevent that by occurring. A lot of times it's simply letting the load touch the ground before the worker touches it, because when it touches the ground, it equalizes those two charges. What you won't see is what we said earlier. Nobody gets killed from that discharge on a helicopter. On the other hand, induction voltage may be low, but if it doesn't carry a current charge, if there's not enough charge, and the very next thing we're going to talk about is the two different forms of induction. You can get shocked, but you can also get killed. And you don't know when the latter of those most dangerous elements is involved, because there's no way to test for it prior to coming into contact with it. So if we're getting shocked on a power line, or shocked on a wood pole, or shocked on a structure, that's not static, it's induction, and induction will kill you. That's the reason why we want to remember this is just like that essential knowledge. Even if you don't understand everything else about the nature of the risk, you need to understand what we've said here is that static won't kill you. But that's not static that we're involved with. If you're getting shocked on a wood pole or a structure or up in the air, that's not static. That's induction, and induction will kill you. So I think that should be pretty clear.
Hey folks, if you're responsible for your training your line workers, you know the challenges, regulation changes, crews come and go, and training must keep up. That's why T&D PowerSkills is such a game changer. With 78 modules built specifically for adult learners, you can customize your message, scale your training program from quick refreshers to full 8,000-hour DOL certified apprenticeship, and manage costs whether you're a small contractor or major utility. It's flexible, it's effective, it's built for the way we train today. check them out at tdpowerskills.com. Again, that is tdpowerskills.com. Jim, I think probably we can pick right up where we kind of just left off in that transition there and the difference between static and induction. And I think probably two big things. So let's explain induction and where it comes from. And like you mentioned, the two different types of induction. And then, once we've kind of laid that groundwork, then maybe we can talk about. So obviously, when we go to work on these work areas or work zones that we've developed for our protection, we apply temporary grounds and bonds, right? And there's a big potential hazard that we're actually installing to protect ourselves. And I had a lot of conversation last week about that with these guys. And it's again, to your point, I think people just don't recognize what's going on there. One, with induction, and then two, how to protect themselves from it when we're in our de-energized work zones.
Yeah, and let's talk about what something that OSHA says, and OSHA hasn't corrected the nature of their statement. They made a statement that has, in itself, said induction is dangerous, but they've misled people about when induction is dangerous. So OSHA has a standard in 1910-269, and the reference is Q2 Roman numeral 4. So it's 1910-269, Q2 Roman numeral 4. And this is what the standard says. Unless the employer can demonstrate that the lines the employees are installing are not subject to induction of a hazardous voltage, temporary protective grounds shall be placed at such locations and arranged in such a manner that the employer can demonstrate will prevent exposure of each employee to hazardous difference in electrical potential. Now, the second part that I read is the same phrase in that Mark read earlier, that is the phrase that requires us to use equipotential grounding for the protection of workers. This rule that OSHA put in recognizes that induction is a risk, but unfortunately, in OSHA's experience, the instances where induction was a risk occurred at construction sites where crews were stringing conductor. So they more or less folded it or into that type of work as the exposure where induction become a risk. And that's not true, because induction can come from a lot of different environments, not just when we're installing conductors and stringing lines, which is what this rule is making a reference to. Because you remember the first part, it says, if the employer can demonstrate that the lines that employees are installing are not subject to induction. So what we have to recognize now is that we know enough about the industry. The industry is familiar enough with induction to know that this is a mistake on OSHA's part that hasn't been corrected, and the rule still says the same thing, but it tells us what we are supposed to do. If we have induction on the site, and if we cannot prove that it's not dangerous, then we must install grounding to help protect that crew from the event or from the exposure of induction. So so now this applies to substations, it applies to underground conductors, it applies to existing systems, existing de-energized systems that may be parallel to or nearby an existing high voltage transmission circuit. And it also applies to transmission circuits themselves. So it's not just about stringing conductors. Wherever induction exists, we have to treat it as if it is deadly unless we can prove that it's not. So that brings us to, when is induction not deadly? Well, that brings us back to the principle of electrocution. So we ask the question, what is it about an electrical contact that is deadly to the person making the contact? Is it voltage or is it current? Yes, everybody's saying the same thing. It's current. That's right. So if it's current that kills you, then we can extrapolate from that voltage without current will not kill you. And that's true. It's the same thing that we said about that static exposure. Static doesn't have current flowing with it. Static is a condition of electrical charge that has no work value. It can't go anywhere. It's not constant. It won't occur again once you've discharged it and equalized the voltage, and there is no current flowing with it. It can do no useful work, which is how power works, voltage and current. So induction can be with current or without current. And so for that reason, the consensus standards, in particular the IEEE standard on grounding, has an explanation about the difference between the two types of current. So one of them is called, the two types of induction. One of them is called capacitive coupling. The other is known as inductive coupling. Capacitive coupling is induction, but has no current component associated with it. It's just voltage. So if I have a distribution system crossing under or a transmission system parallel to an energized transmission circuit, I can get an electrical charge on that conductor by virtue of its relationship to an energized circuit. That comes from how close is it? Do they run parallel to each other? How much voltage is in that host energized circuit? And how much current is flowing in that circuit? The voltage and current create an electrical field. And if the circuit or the conductor that I'm working on intersects that electrical field, depending on how close it is to that electrical field, will determine how much voltage can be built up on that conductor. Now, this brings me to some kind of things that I've heard that are really kind of nonsensical, but it's because people don't understand the nature of induction. And as a contractor, I had, and this particular time was in California, which doesn't necessarily mean to disparage California, but in this case, the engineers who were in charge of this thing required that we drag static dissipation attachments on our pickup trucks and trucks that we were going to be driving into this huge 500 kV switchyard. And the reason that they wanted to do that was because a vehicle could receive an electrical charge if you were inside of that substation. Well, it was funny when it did that because if you touched the vehicle, you'd get shocked, but nothing was going to happen. Nobody was going to get killed. It's not a current carrying conductor. It's just simply an electrical charge that builds up on the vehicle. And we've been dealing with this, since I was a lineman, now for 30 years. But this company had a zero tolerance for any electrical contact. And they correctly knew that induction could be hazardous or deadly, but they didn't understand the difference between these two electrical concepts, one of them being this capacitive coupling that we're talking about that is voltage only, and the other, which is known as inductive coupling or magnetic coupling. And when you have inductive coupling or magnetic coupling, you have a current component that will flow with the pathway for this induction. Now, here's the difference between the two. If I have capacitive coupling or an electrical charge that's on the conductor that I'm working on, and it's coming from a nearby, let's say, 345 transmission circuit, if I install a ground on that conductor I'm working on, when I install that ground, it's going to pop. There's going to be a visible arc as I make that connection, and the voltage is going to collapse on that circuit. Once I install that ground, I can touch it. I'm not going to feel anything. Nothing's going to happen. If I put an amp meter on that grounding cable, it's not going to show any current flow. to it. It's capacitive coupling. It's voltage only. And we control that voltage and the possible shock that we could get from it by simply putting a ground on that conductor. Now, here is the difference. Typically, when we work with grounds, especially when we're building a power line next to a energized transmission circuit, we'll put up grounds at both ends of the work. In other words, brackets. If we install a second ground, we create a pathway. That pathway is created by, let's say that we're facing the conductor, we have a ground on our left and a ground on our right, and we have an induction source from this energized circuit. The ground on our left becomes a pathway to ground. The earth is a conductive pathway. The ground on my right now closes a circulating current pathway that will allow current to flow. Now, the current is not coming through the earth. Typically when we do a sympathetic diagram of our scientific electrical class where we have a 6-volt battery and we got a little knife switch and it got a light bulb, a 6-volt light bulb or any kind of light bulb, and the other side of that circuit comes back to the other pole on the battery. So we see the battery as being the pathway. Well, if you visualize this circuit that I'm talking about with two different grounds, the earth completes the circuit. The induction source is essentially the battery. Out in the middle of the sky, the source of current is available. And when I create grounds on the left of me and grounds on the right of me, I now have closed and completed a circuit so that if the induction source will support current flow, now I can measure current flow in that circuit. Now, that's when it starts to become dangerous. And in every one of the induction fatality cases that we have investigated, this is that source. This is that current. There was a pathway that was created by grounds on the system that nobody recognized was contained a current, and then they inadvertently opened that ground system, thinking that it was safe to do so. Now that's a problem. It wouldn't happen if we followed what we call the cardinal rules of grounding, because the cardinal rules of grounding are related to grounding of every circuit and their general rules, and we call them cardinal rules. And by the way, there's no standard anywhere that has the cardinal rules of grounding, but there are tons of standards and references that make references, and OSHA does too, to some safety things that we have to do in order to not create a risk with our grounding. And we've said before that we have had cases where we can describe it simply as that the line worker was killed by the grounds that they installed for their own protection. So we came up with the cardinal rules of grounding, and we share those with our clients when we do training. So here's what the cardinal rules of grounding would say. When you make a ground connection, you make the ground source connection first. In other words, the ground electrodes. So whether it's the neutral or a ground rod or a pole bond, you make that connection first. Then you connect to the nearest phase with a hot stick. You ground in order of the closest phase first. And then you disconnect in reverse order. And then you always use a hot stick. And the last one, number 6, is never handle the unconnected end of a connected ground cable. Doesn't matter what it's connected to, never handle the connected end, with the exception of the ground electrode connection that's isolated from all other sources. You could do that. So our cardinal rules: 1, make the ground electrode connection first. 2, connect to the closest phase first with a hot stick. 3, ground in order of closest phase first. 4, disconnect in reverse order. 5, always use a hot stick, and 6, never handle the unconnected end of a connected ground cable. So that takes us back to this idea of circulating current, because a lot of people first hear this and they're surprised about it. It makes sense. And usually, especially when we're doing substation grounds, because we have a ready source of being able to test this theory. And when I do substation grounding, and especially if we have what we call a practical component, after we spend a day in the classroom, we go into the substation the next day, and we look at real installations and then go back through some of the concepts that we've studied the day before. And usually when we do that, you'll find the substation techs all showing up with an amp meter, and the first thing they do is they go to a power transformer and they put a clamp amp meter on their ground for that transformer, and find out, some of them for the first time in 20 years of work, that there's 19 amps of current flowing off of that power transformer. Never thought about that. Well, we don't ever want to open up a circuit that has current flowing in it, because if we do, it's the same thing as a system neutral, or same thing as a phase. If I open a current carrying conductor on the two open ends, in that gap, I can have a voltage as high as whatever system voltage is related to the current that's flowing on that circuit. And the same thing happens in these grounded circuits. That's the reason why in the cardinal rules it says you always handle it with a hot stick, and that you never handle the unconnected end of a connected ground cable, because if there is a current flowing in that ground scheme, you're subject to being electrocuted. And that's the difference between the two. Capacitive coupling is voltage only. Voltage without current will shock you, it won't kill you. Inductive coupling is induction that includes a current carrying component. So this induction has both voltage and current. And if you get yourself in that circuit, it will, and certainly can, kill you. It requires, again, those two grounds to make that happen. But that's almost every installation that we make when we're building a power line or working inside of a substation or working on distribution. We tend to bracket. And if we do have two sources then of ground, then we can have circulating current. And in one of the last ones that we investigated that ended up going all the way to Washington, in a federal case of an employer and OSHA, that's exactly what happened. The installation where the one crew was working, they hung a set of grounds where they were working, but there were 5 crews doing different elements of construction in this power line construction. And the other crews also installed grounds. And they simply didn't see that as being a bracket. And recognizing that when that other crew put that set of grounds up, they now created a circulating current from the nearby 500 kV source. So does that make sense, Mark? Did I explain that well enough without having that visual cues that people can use to understand?
Yeah, I think so. I think you did a good job of breaking that down. It's like you said, it's nice to have that visual slide on the screen. Unfortunately, we don't have that here. But yeah, I think at least for me, and I might be a little more in tune to this just because of our conversations and so on. But I think that was a pretty good explanation.
Yeah, there's another thing in the standard about induction. When I say the standard, of course, talking about the OSHA standard, is that when you're installing those conductors, it requires that the employer make a study of and identify the amount of voltage that is present in that circuit and whether or not it's going to be hazardous. And I got to tell you that that's almost an impossible thing to do because induction itself is not as simple as here's the conductor that I'm going to be crossing nearby. I'm going to be 35 feet away from it, and it's 230,000 volts. and we're going to be parallel for 44 spans.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a table that you can go to that says this is what the current is going to be, because if you're trying to compute the voltage and current that can be available from a circuit, this is what's known as a graduate level computation. And when we say graduate level, you're talking about doctor of something or other,
Mm-hmm.
because everything has a capacitive relationship to it when you have high voltage. So let's say that I have a three-phase line, A, B, and C, and I have a three-phase line, A, B, and C, that I'm building. Well, in order to calculate the induction voltage that's going to be available, I have to calculate several capacitive relationships, because the capacitive relationships all serve to increase or dampen the amount of voltage that can be generated in this exposure. So I don't know what all of them are going to be, but it's kind of like this. You're going to calculate the induction value from A phase to ground, from A phase to the tower, from A phase to B phase, A phase to C phase, and then from A phase to the de-energized C phase circuit, from A phase to B phase to C phase. Then you're going to do the same thing for B phase energized circuit, to ground, to each other, to the structure, to the other phases. And then after you do all those together and combine them in some sort of a mathematical statement, you also have to include the current that's flowing on the host circuit. Well, once you've done all of that calculation and now you have a number, the current changes, and when the current changes, so does the number.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that you can there's no way you can do this from the field, and there's no way, even though somebody could calculate it at a certain moment in time. And I have some associates that I work with in litigation, and I've seen this calculation because I'm not qualified to do it. And the person that I have used, and don't have his permission to use his name, but he's a PhD in electrical physics or something along those lines. He has recognized for being able to do this. He's an expert in high voltage or transmission voltage phenomenon, and we hired him to do the calculation because at the time of the induction incident, we had the exact numbers on the current on the circuit using the relay information available from the utilities. So he could, with certitude, he could calculate what that voltage and current was at the time of the incident. But that's not something we can do in the field, but it's something for us to recognize, because it boils down to this. First of all, we need to have a certain amount of experience in the field to make a judgment on what the potential for exposure is. And that pretty much boils down to, I'm building a circuit, I've got an energized 345, closest phase is 70 yards away. We're probably going to have induction. Anybody who works in the field knows that that's the case. And if we have induction, the rule in OSHA says, unless the employer can show that it's not dangerous, we have to assume that it is. And then if we assume that it is, we have to install grounding to collapse that voltage. And oddly enough, everybody ought to pick this question out pretty easily. Why does OSHA only say determine the voltage that will be present in the induction circuit? Give you a second to think about that. Because if voltage can't break the resistance of your skin, current can't flow, and you can't be injured. We've said that in the last couple of podcasts, because that's one of the important knowledge things that we need to possess to understand that voltage will shock you, but without a current component, it won't kill you. So voltage is the important equation here. Is the voltage high enough to shock you? If it can shock you, current can flow, and you could be fatally injured. So that's how that breaks down.
So I happen to be intimately familiar with a 500 kV incident where a crew was changing a B-phase wave trap at a 500 kV substation, and
Uh,
side by side terminals, one line de-energized, the other line energized, ran in the same right of way for 110 miles. The incident employee got in between, basically broke their bracket ground circuit, right? And he became part of that circuit, and miraculously somehow lived to tell about it. Obviously, he's missing some extremities, but when we went back about 6 weeks later to actually perform the work and finish the job, because when the incident happened, it just shut the job down. We hooked the stuff back up and put the line back in service. But when the de-energized line was opened via circuit breaker by the system operator, we watched the metering in the relay house, and current drops to zero, voltage drops to zero, and almost instantaneously from that energized line now inducing voltage on the de-energized line, the closest phase to the energized line had 24.5 kV on it. The B phase line that they were working on had 13 kV, and the furthest line away from the energized line had 7.5 kV on it. And instantaneously, within 4 or 5 seconds, that registered on the metering in the relay house. So, obviously every incident's going to be different. Again, like you said, based on the host circuit and conditions and how far they are, parallel themselves and so on. But, that just gives you some idea what type of voltage you're dealing with here, and it's all induction.
Yeah, and actually, I have 2 wave trap incidents,
Yep.
and very similar conditions to the one that you were describing, but both of the ones that I worked on were fatal.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of those cases, when we were going back to do the investigation, we did the exact same thing. We set up the exposure in order to determine what the exposure was.
Mm-hmm.
So we created those same conditions, and we were watching the Schweitzer relays when they de-energized that circuit. And this was about 6 weeks post incident, and we saw the exact same thing. When they de-energized, we saw immediately the voltage collapse to zero, but then almost immediately the exact same thing happened, and it jumped up to around 8,000 volts. So that's not an unusual number that Mark's talking about when he says that they have from 2,000 to 7,000 volts of induction, because we see that frequently. And I was not too long ago was doing grounding training with one of our clients in Texas, and they were grounding a de-energized circuit. And this particular employer had never tested for voltage before they grounded. They just simply grounded, the circuit. And testing for voltage is one of the requirements. And the purpose of testing for voltage is to ensure that you don't have live circuit voltage on the circuit you're getting ready to throw a ground on. Because that would be a bad thing. Well, they never did test for voltage. They didn't understand that that was a requirement of the standard. They just knew that they had open and open on both sides, and they knew it was de-energized. So they would throw a ground on it, and they would hear a pop, and they never paid. They just knew that was normal. So now that we introduced them to testing with a voltmeter, they got the appropriate voltmeters. And then the very first day that we went to do a live installation, and they opened the circuit, they had a de-energized circuit, and the crew climbed up the structure, and they laid that voltmeter out there, and they got 2,700 volts. And I saw everybody looking at each other on the pole. And I said, yeah, I called up and I said, that's supposed to be there. And they turned around and looked at me and they said, that is 2,700 volts. And I said, yeah, I know. It's always been there.
Yep.
But that's what's unusual about this induction voltage. There's 2 things about it. One of them is that I can throw a ground on it and it's not going to explode like it would if I had a 2,700 volt distribution circuit. If I put a ground on that, there's going to be a big explosion until the relay locks everything out. That doesn't happen with induction voltage. Once you ground it, it just goes away, collapses to zero.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is when you pull an arc off of an induction source, if I lift a ground off of a conductor, I can sometimes get an arc. And this is an example of probably like worst case. I was the first lineman that was going to break a bracket ground on a 500 kV circuit in a right-of-way with 3 500 kV circuits. And we were using 18-foot shotguns. We had like 60-foot long 4-aught ground. So a guy in the bucket with me is holding up the weight of the cable, and I'm operating the stick. And when I lifted the ground off of the phase, I drew an arc that was about 20 feet long, and it wouldn't break. And just because of my nature of understanding arcs, that concerned me somewhat, and I put it back. And when I put it back, it collapsed, of course. And so we had to do a couple of things in order to reduce that induced voltage charge so that we could break that arc. And once we broke it the first time, we now opened up the circuit, and the other ones were able to remove. But what I didn't know was if I lift a jumper on a phase and I draw an arc, and if that arc touches a phase at a different potential or touches a pole, it's going to go to ground. There's going to be a big flash. That doesn't happen with induction arcs. If I have an induction arc and it blows around in the wind and touches the pole, it's simply going to go out. It's not going to blow up. It's not going to relay the system. It's not going to be a big flash, and it's not going to splatter aluminum and everything else all over the place. It's just going to go out. And it'll be the same thing if it hits another phase. It's the same thing. There's no such thing as a cross phase between induction arcs, because even though they may be at different measurable voltages, they're all from the same source. They're all the same thing. They simply just collapse and they're gone.
Another great episode, Jim, in talking about the realties, right, that we see out there. If everybody listening remembers one thing, what does that need to be? What does that one thing need to be when it comes to induction and working at these higher transmission voltages?
It's probably related to induction. Everything about grounding, whether it's transmission or distribution or underground, all those principles are exactly the same. The one component of grounding in transmission is this issue of induction, and in particular, this issue of capacitive coupling. So static may be funny when you get shocked with it, but you need to realize that it needs to be turn that laugh upside down. Say turn your frown upside down and make it a smile. Okay, it's not funny when it kills you, and it can. Induction is deadly. It needs to be understood for what it is, and it needs to be taken care of or controlled, recognizing that it is deadly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a message we can't get out there fast enough. So training and safety professionals face more pressure than ever to keep their line worker programs compliant, current, and cost-effective. T&D PowerSkills offers a 78-unit curriculum that gives you total control. Customize the training content to match your needs. Deliver it your way, whether you're doing short refreshers or managing a full DOL-certified apprenticeship program. And best of all, you can scale the program to fit your operation no matter the size. Visit tndpowerskills.com to see how you can take control of your training. Again, that's tdpowerskills.com. And as always, in our closing here, we need to state that the views and opinions shared in this podcast are the personal viewpoints of the participants and may not necessarily reflect the stance of the Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction and its staff. It's highly advised to consult your company management before implementing any actions or policy changes. Also, please support the sponsors bringing you this content. And for more episodes of ISBC Tailboard Talks, subscribe to your favorite podcatcher and be sure to leave a review. We'd love to hear from you. Again, if you have questions out of today's episode, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email at mark@ispconline.com, and we will either have a follow-up Q&A session to this series, or if we just have a limited amount of questions, we will reach out to you individually. Jim, again, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time and taking a little bit of time to share your expertise and knowledge with the industry. The more I start to go around and do this stuff that you've been doing for the last 20 years, it's very evident that we need to to keep talking and keep sharing and keep getting this stuff out there, because unfortunately, we're just not getting everybody where they need to be. And so hopefully at some point we'll be able to do that. So.
And thank you, Mark. I understand that the whole idea of the podcast was your idea. I'm glad that you brought it up and made this available for us to be able to reach the industry. You know, there's nobody at ISPC or our sister companies that we work with and the sponsors of this program. There's nobody out here that's doing this for money.
Right.
You know, we have to get paid, you know, obviously, but we're doing this because we care about the people that we work with.
Yep.
And there's no reason to go out there and die on your job.
That's right.
We can prevent that with information and with training, and we can help people understand, you know, what it is. And this is a resource that you put together, and I and my colleagues that are here or participate in the podcast really appreciate it. So thank you.
Not a problem. It's my pleasure.